It was October 1919 in Cornwall. 130 men had just finished their shift underground. Hours of exhausting, dangerous work in the heat and dark beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Covered in sweat and dust, they stepped onto the man engine, the old mechanical lift that slowly carried workers up to the surface. It had been part of their routine for years, familiar and predictable. Then came a noise. A sudden, sharp crack from somewhere above, loud enough to stop conversation and to freeze movement. It was just after 3 p.m, and in an instant, everything changed. Levant Mine sits on the edge of the cliffs at St Just, right at the far western tip of Cornwall. If you go any further west, you're in the sea. From the surface, it doesn't look like much. A few stone buildings, rusted bits of machinery, the sea stretching out behind it. But underground, it was once a maze of tunnels and shafts stretching over a mile beneath the Atlantic. The mine opened in 1820. It produced tin and copper, two metals that had been pulled out of Cornish rock for centuries. At its height, Levant employed between 400 and 600 people, men mostly, but also boys as young as 14. Then there were some women and even younger children working above ground, crushing the ore ready for sale. They were paid barely enough to live on. After the war, money was tight everywhere, and the mines were no exception. But men kept showing up because they had families, because there was nothing else, and because it's what they had always done. In towns like St Just, you didn't have many choices. If you were fit, you went underground. And underground they went. Levant was a very deep mine, about 2,000 feet from the surface to the bottom of the main shaft, and from there the tunnels stretched out more than a mile beneath the Atlantic. In some places, just 40 feet of rock separated the miners from the ocean above. On rough days, they said you could hear the waves rumbling overhead. Like distant thunder, only closer. It was a hard place to work. The air was thick and heavy, getting worse the deeper you went. At the bottom it could hit 40 degrees, so hot and humid that most of the men worked shirtless. Boots filled with sweat, so some didn't bother with them at all. Everything was damp. Mud caked the floors. The tunnels were narrow, the walls slick. The only light they had came from candle lamps that they would dip into the mud and stick to their helmets. They didn't give much light though, and often not for long before a draft would blow them out. So they carried matches in little brass tins to keep them dry. They got used to working in the dark. There were regular injuries at the mine. Some men came up burned from blasting charges, others blinded by falling rock, or broken limbs from falls. Flooding was a constant threat. The only thing keeping the sea out was a single pump working around the clock. Everyone knew that if it failed, even for a few minutes, there'd be no way out. It's easy to think that the worst part of working at Levant was the mining itself, but it wasn't. The digging, the blasting, the shoveling, that was just the middle of the day. What came after the long working day was often worse. When the shift was over, the men didn't clock out and go home, they climbed. The 2,000 feet of ladders into the mine were broken up into 80 sections. They were old and unsteady. Climbing them at the end of a shift took over an hour, in fact closer to 90 minutes. But they arduously climbed, rung after rung in the heat and in the dark, and always with the worry that one slip could end everything. The candles on their helmets blew out constantly. There were drafts in the shaft that never stopped. Cold air rushed past as men tried to hold their balance and find the next rung. If you dropped a match or lost your footing, there were no second chances. More than one man had fallen. Everyone knew someone who had. And then, once they finally reached the top, soaked, bruised, light-headed, there was still the walk home. Some had miles to go. Up the hill, through wind and rain, past empty fields and stone walls. There were no cars or buses, just the road and whatever was left in their legs. Then, in 1857, something new was brought in. It was called the man engine. At the time, it felt like a miracle. It worked like this. A steam engine on the surface powered a series of long rods that moved up and down through the shaft. Fixed to those rods were metal steps, spaced about 12 feet apart. The rods moved slowly and steadily. A man would stand on a step as it lifted him 12 feet, and then step across to a fixed platform while the rod dropped and reset. When the next step came up, he'd hop on again, up another 12 feet, and then off, then on again, over and over until he reached daylight. It was slow and repetitive, but it meant you didn't have to climb. You could save your strength. And when you've been underground for 10 hours in 40-degree heat, that matters. More than 100 men could ride it at once, and it ran like clockwork throughout the day. For the miners, it cut the journey to the surface down to about 30 minutes. That extra hour made a huge difference to their legs, lungs, and energy levels overall. It didn't fix everything. The work was still brutal, and the mine was still dangerous. But it made the end of the day just a little more bearable. And down there, that was no small thing. For more than 60 years, the MAN engine did exactly what it was built to do. It carried men up and down the shaft, day after day, without fail. But by 1919, time had caught up with it. The structure had become worn, the timber weakened, and the movement no longer felt safe. Miners raised concerns, but nothing was done. It had worked for decades, and for management, that seemed good enough. On Monday, October the 20th, 1919, it was a normal shift. Most of the men working at Levant that day were locals, born and raised in St Just or the surrounding villages. Some had fought in the war and come home to this. Others had been working the mine their entire lives. One of them was William Murley. He was 29. He had 3 children and another on the way. That morning he kissed his wife Anita goodbye, then turned back a few minutes later. He'd forgotten his matchbox. That kind of thing was said to be bad luck. William got to the mine just after 7, pressed a lump of clay to his helmet, fixed his candle in place and stepped onto the MAN engine to start the long ride down. He wasn't alone. That day, 130 men clocked in, the usual crew doing the usual routine. And some men were on their way up at the end of their shift, making their journey home. At the bottom, he climbed off, grabbed his pick and got to work. It was a long shift, hours of digging, lifting, sweating, nothing unusual or out of the ordinary. Later that afternoon, it was time to head back up. William joined the rest of the men and began the slow ride to the surface. On, off, wait. On, off, wait. The engine groaned through the shaft like it always did, lifting them home one step at a time. Near the top of the shaft, something gave. A metal link holding the MAN engine together snapped, and the top section, about 360 feet of machinery, broke free and plummeted. It fell fast, crashing down through the shaft and tearing everything with it. Timber, bolts, beams, all of it came loose. Men who had been riding that section were dragged with it. Some managed to jump clear, but others didn't stand a chance. The falling rod hit with such force it snapped in half mid-fall. It finally jammed, stuck at around 400 feet down. That sudden stop likely saved the men below from being crushed by the debris. But it also meant the lift was gone, and anyone still underground now had no way out. When the noise stopped, everything went quiet. The shaft was still and there was no movement, and more ominously, no voices. Down in the mine, the survivors were in total darkness. They didn't know what had happened, only that something had gone badly wrong. Those who could still move lit their candles and started digging. They didn't wait. Even with broken bones and bleeding, they went looking for others. Above ground, word spread fast. People knew something terrible had happened, but by the time they looked down the shaft, there was nothing to see, just darkness. The MAN engine was gone. They started calling for help. They knew it was bad. People shouted down, hoping to hear something, anything, but there was no reply. Someone needed to go down to assess what had happened. One man stepped forward and without any fuss, he grabbed his gear, clipped on and started climbing. He went down slowly, rung by rung, all the way to the last pitch, and then he held up his lamp. What he saw didn't need words. Bodies crushed under timbers, some buried, some half visible, some still breathing, asking for help, others beyond saving. Tragically, he knew their faces. He climbed back up and recounted what he'd seen. They needed everyone they could find to mount this rescue and recovery operation. Word spread quickly. Volunteer men came in from nearby towns and other mines. Whoever could get there. They didn't wait to be asked, they knew what needed doing. They got to work at the 400-foot mark, clearing debris, checking for signs of life. It was slow going. Nearly every shovelful turned up another body. When they found someone, dead or alive, they tied them to a rope and hauled them out the old way, one ladder at a time. Roughly 100 men were still trapped below. The main shaft was blocked solid with timber and fallen rock. There was no way through. So they made a radical decision. If they couldn't come up the way they went down, they'd have to find another path. That meant climbing sideways through the tunnels and then up through the skip shaft and the engine shaft. A tough, dangerous route, even on a good day. About 2 hours later, some of the trapped men made it out. They appeared in the engine room, covered in dirt, soaked in sweat and barely able to speak. A few were carried. 12 of them were hurt so badly it was unlikely they'd ever work again. Miner Willie Lawry, just 14 and newly at Levant, was near the top of the shaft. In his own words, he emerged with broken ribs and teeth, but alive. I had 36 stitches in my face and neck, lost all my front teeth, a collarbone broke, and 8 of my ribs were crushed. He was one of the lucky few who jumped off in time, clinging to life as the man engine plummeted past him. And John Grenfell, who was caught on a shaft solar, a kind of platform. He was among the first to rush back down after the collapse. He later helped hoist injured men up, knowing every shift had helped prepare him for that moment of crisis. By the end of that first night, they knew 10 men were gone, but more were still missing. The rescue carried on for days. By Wednesday afternoon, they were still hearing faint sounds. One man was groaning, alive under the rubble, but by the time they reached him that evening, it was too late. After that, there were no more survivors. On the Sunday morning, they brought up the last body. The final toll was 31 lives. William Murley was one of them, and so was his uncle. That Monday night, William's wife Anita waited with the kids. She had his dinner all prepared, but he didn't return home at his normal time. His dinner grew cold. 6 p.m. came and went, and William was nowhere to be seen. Other wives nearby reported that their men had not returned from the mine either. Anita hoped maybe the shift had just run late, but as the hours passed, hope faded. The next day she saw his name in the paper, but she didn't really need to. She already knew. In a place like St. Just, news like that doesn't stay quiet. Almost every family lost someone. A father, a brother, a son. Some families lost more than one. It said 75 children were left without their dads. In one household alone, 11 siblings were orphaned. It hit hard, and it hit home. 11 years after the disaster, in 1930, Levant Mine closed for good. Tin prices had collapsed, and the mine could no longer stay afloat. On their final shift, the men hung up their tools and walked away. Not long after, the pumps were shut off, and the sea slowly crept in. The tunnels flooded, and the place fell silent. For years it stood as a reminder of what had happened down there. Not just the work, but the loss. In 1967 the site was passed to the National Trust. And then in 1992 they brought the old steam engine back to life, the same one that had powered the man engine. Today it's the only Cornish beam engine still running on its original site. In 2019, 100 years after the collapse, families of those who died returned. They held a service and read out names of those who were lost. Stories were shared and people remembered. And for a moment, the mine wasn't just a relic. It was a place of grief, of pride, and of connection, still standing and still telling its story. People were bitter, rightly so. They'd lost husbands, sons, and brothers, and they knew it didn't have to happen. The man engine had been failing for years. Everyone saw it, and everyone had said so. There was an inquiry, and the ruling was accidental death. They blamed it on wear and tear and said a part had simply just given out. No one was charged. Most didn't accept it, but that was as far as it went. The shaft where it broke stayed sealed shut. There was some compensation, a bit from the government, a bit from the community. People gave what they could. It helped pay bills, and it helped people stay afloat. But it didn't fix anything. It didn't bring anyone home. Levant was more than a mine, it was a way of life, and for many, the only life they knew. When the man engine fell, it didn't just take 31 men. It tore through families, futures, and a whole community's sense of safety. A century has passed, but the echoes of that day still linger in the stone and sea. The names carved into memorials are more than history. They're reminders of what was lost when warnings were ignored and lives were measured against cost. In remembering them, we don't just honour the dead, we speak for the living too. Now, that was a horrific story of terrible loss for a small community. But I hope you liked the presentation of the video. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll say bye-bye for now.